Welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for joining us today. What is Jewish film? Well, Dr. Eric Goldman believes it's a unique way through which we can closely examine Jewish history, past and present. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Goldman, adjunct professor of cinema at Yeshiva University and Farley Dickinson University, a noted scholar and educator on Yiddish, Israeli, and Jewish American film. Dr. Goldman will speak with me about the Jewish experience in cinema and how it can highlight changes in Jewish life over the last century. He's also the author of two books, Visions, Images, and Dreams, Yiddish Films, Past and Present, and The American Jewish Story Through Cinema, and also hosts the monthly program Jewish Cinematheque on the Jewish Broadcasting Service. Dr. Goldman was curator of film for the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research and has curated several Jewish film festivals, including the Ring Family Israel Film Series at Yeshiva University. And in 2014, Turner Classic Movies featured a 20-film series co-hosted by Dr. Goldman on the Jewish experience in cinema. He received his PhD in cinema studies from New York University and holds graduate degrees in contemporary Jewish studies and theater arts from Brandeis University. Eric, thank you for being here with us today.
It's wonderful to be with you, Dan.
Well, we studied together at Brandeis, so this is sort of a graduate school reunion, but we'll leave the reunion part for after we do the program. And we're going to start right out with your unusual path to your ultimate profession. You were attending Temple University with the intention of becoming a medical doctor when you took a course entitled The History of the Middle East. A part of the classwork on the subject of the Algerian War was a film that you watched with the class called The Battle of Algiers, which is a classic film. And you realized the power of the visual, not just to entertain, but also to educate. And at that point, you knew that you wanted to pull together your two loves, which are film and Jewish education. Now, is this understanding of film as edutainment, as you put it, the underlying goal of Yiddish, Israeli, and Jewish American film? Is it really to educate and to entertain?
Look, film is a business and it's an expensive business. So if you're going to make a film, you want to be able to make back your costs. But along the way, particularly with the early Yiddish film, there was a desire to reach out to the Yiddish speaking audience and to satiate them, to give them some kind of pleasure, and in some cases, education.
Well, the birth of the commercial cinema in America dates to around the turn of the 20th century, shooting films out there in Fort Lee, and all of the early attempts at bringing this new way of entertaining into being. Are we able to pinpoint the film in which Jews are first depicted on screen, and how were they portrayed at the time?
That's a great question. I can't necessarily point my finger at one film. There was a film shot in Jerusalem in the I think it was around 1897 by the Méliès brothers. But the bottom line was that that the depictions were negative. The people making the films often would be making anti-Semitic films, portrayals of Jews. And then slowly but surely, as Jews entered the business, and that happened quite quickly, because who were the early viewers of movies? They were immigrants. So the Jewish immigrants began making movies for the Jewish immigrants. And at that point, there was a shift. And then you had more of a positive presentation, and the bad guys wound up being the Cossacks or just people who slaughtered Jews.
Well, let's talk about the silent era, which lasted until the late 1920s. Were the stories told in American films made by Jews at that time influenced by Yiddish theater and melodrama, or were they reflective of the realities of life, such as the conditions in the factories and tenements? Yiddish theater at that time was booming. As you say, immigrants, this was immigrant entertainment. And there was the Jewish Rialto and all of the Yiddish theaters along Second Avenue. So what was being reflected here? The realities of life, or was it simply, melodrama just to entertain?
If you look at American silent film, the early movie makers were trying to tell a story about becoming American. So it was not unusual to see the story of different ethnic groups, different religions coming together, marrying, having children, and creating the melting pot dream. So those were the films directed at the immigrants. Where they pulled that from, a lot of that was in the Yiddish theater. As a matter of fact, people from Broadway used to come down to Second Avenue and watch Yiddish plays because there was incredible amounts of experimentation. Wonderful theater, some of it coming from Europe. And there's no question that early cinema was influenced by this just as well.
Well, what kind of movie making, you mentioned Europe, what kind of movie making was occurring in Europe during that period? Did Ernst Lubitsch, for example, direct or act in movies with explicit Jewish characters or subjects, or perhaps with film subjects that maybe had a covert Jewish reference?
So I think what we need to do is sort of separate the beginning of the 20th century and the 20s, where in Europe, particularly in Germany, in just groundbreaking cinema was taking place. And you had many of the Jews many Jews who were the center of that German creativity. So they did not necessarily, or they implicitly show their Jewishness. These were films that were made for a broad German public. That changed when many of them emigrated to the United States. Some of them all of a sudden realizing that they were Jews. And that was a new reality. They saw themselves as Germans. They saw themselves as Austrians. And in many cases, their Jewishness was so unimportant. And that, of course, suddenly a man named Hitler and just the changes of anti-Semitic activity in the late 20s, early 30s brought about a realization of Jewishness that they had never really felt. And did it affect the kinds of movies they made? No, because Lubitsch and the other greats just went on continuing to do their work. But internally, and in terms of the activities they had off camera, there was a greater sense of Jewishness. There was one in particular, Edgar Ulmer, who was one of the interesting filmmakers in Austria. When he came to the United States, Yiddish movie makers felt they needed to bring their movie making one step up, and they brought in this assimilated Jew and who didn't know Yiddish, and they had him directing Yiddish movies. So that happened sometimes, but not all that often.
Stu, before we get to the sound here, I wanted to spend a little more time on Germany and Austria. There were, fortunately, a number of people in the film business and others in the broader area of culture who were able to get out before they could not, before the doors really were locked. And a number of them did find their way into Hollywood. But I always try to think that how many more perished in the Holocaust, those in that field, of course, and in every other field. But I'm thinking of people like Billy Wilder and others, folks who came over and who were able to find a place in a Hollywood that was really, now the engine was really beginning to run, and they did find a place. But let's talk about the sound era, brought in with a 1927 Jewish themed movie, The Jazz Singer, which included the iconic chanting of the Kol Nidre prayer, which still moves me every time I see it. Tell us a little about the impact of that film on how Jews and Jewish stories were depicted in films in the 20s and 30s.
The films of the first really 25 years were what I like to call assimilationist films, the films that I described. The Catholic child, Jewish child, falling in love and coming together and having that all-American baby. What happened with The Jazz Singer is we just have in a sense, a real continuation of that, because if you look at the story, it's a Jewish boy whose parents are traditional Jews. His father's a cantor, but he wants out. He wants America. And who does he find in America? He finds his non-Jewish woman friend. So that is a centerpiece of a continuum of this assimilationist message. What's different here is that the Warner Brothers there were four boys. Two of them were European born and very Jewishly connected, and the two American born were not as much so. So the two European born boys and their very Jewish father said, wait a minute, you got to give this more Jewish center. And they said, we want to bring in Kenner Label of Waldman to sing a song. We want to have more of the Jewish essence. You have to understand that the Warner Brothers at the time had a company that was about to go bust. And they were able to buy this, we'll call it a property, this story off of Broadway at a very inexpensive price because nobody was making Jewish stories. So here they had this story, and there was a pull internally between the brothers. And as a result, you have Yosel Rosenblatt singing his Yortzeit lead in the middle of the film, and you have Al Jolson, the number one vocalist at the time, singing Kol Nitra. It was beautiful to watch.
Let's move beyond the Warner Brothers for a second. In Hollywood, at that time, you talk about the assimilation. So in other words, the folks who were managing or running these studios who were Jewish, are you saying they were pulling back from really kind of letting out with Jewish pride, with treating Jewish subjects in a better rounded way?
Absolutely. They were frightened. These were guys who were building wealth, who were building power in a society that was growing more and more anti-Jewish. We sometimes forget that the 20s and 30s were times when things were tough for Jews. The stories come down, my parents came here and look at what they did. But there were very clear guidelines of what Jews could and couldn't do. And here you had this powerhouse growing up in Hollywood, and they were afraid of being discovered as Jews. So they did everything within their power to keep their Jewishness very low priority. As a matter of fact, Dan, what's fascinating is that when Hitler came to power in 1933, what did the Jews of Hollywood do? Nothing. They were too frightened to bring attention to themselves. And the following year, when there was pressure, we have to speak out. We have to do something to say, what's happening in Europe is not acceptable. The only one to come forward was the non-Jew, Darryl Zanuck. And he said, wait a minute, we have to speak out. We have to fight this thing. And he makes a movie called The House of Rothschilds, which set in the 17th and 18th century is really an anti-German film, something that no Jew at that time would ever consider. There were other factors too. There was the Catholic Church, which was putting a lot of pressure on the Jews of Hollywood and even forced them to create their own production board, which in effect censored certain types of films, including films that would be anti-German. So the Jews wanted to be quiet.
So was the House of Rothschild, where did we see the beginning of serious issues that were focused on American Jews? Where did that begin? What were the first films in addition to the House of Rothschild? What were the others? Who were the directors, the writers who were starring in these films?
Who came forward and spoke out for Jewish issues?
Not who spoke out, but where do we see Jews being treated in a fair, in a serious, and in a sympathetic way? Where does that start? Where does the stereotyping end, or the kind of whitewashing and the beginning of treating Jewish subjects seriously?
So part of that was the Production Code Administration, which was pushed on the Hollywood moguls back in 1930 and really began to be enforced in 33, 34. Pushed on them by the church to censor and to cut back on stereotyping, to cut back on anything that might be interpreted as film propaganda. And so that really ended, I would say, in the late 1920s with the conclusion. Remember, silent films continued a year or two past The Jazz Singer. Some of the greatest silent films were made after the jazz singer. So the stereotyping sort of ends. And at that point, especially in 1932, 33 with Roosevelt, sort of this American dream and all Americans are wonderful and terrific, and let's celebrate America, and let's have these great dazzling musicals, and let's deal with some of the great American classics and turn them into cinema. That's when it fades out. But in terms of Jewishness, it's missing. It's totally kept off to the side. The Jewish filmmakers didn't want to put anything out there that was Jewish.
Well, talk to us about Yiddish film, which is also occurring at this time here and abroad during the 1930s. There was probably a big demand for films in Yiddish in that decade. Certainly, that large Yiddish-speaking community in Europe. So were Jewish directors, producers, and studios eager to have Jewish stories appear on screen in the Yiddish language? And would you say that there were specific Yiddish film genres or storylines? And where were these films made? Were these Hollywood films? And in Europe, where did they make these films?
So you have to understand that the early movies were inexpensive entertainment for the masses, for the immigrant population. The middle class would not go to a movie theater. They were dirty. There were storefronts. There were Nickelodeons. That began to change in the mid-20s. So with the advent of sound, what happens is that Yiddish-speaking population no longer has access to that entertainment, because when it was silent, there was no language barrier. Now, all of a sudden, these films are in English and you're listening to them, and there are no intertitles. And even the intertitles on good silent films are not necessary. You follow the action. Now, all of a sudden, they were excluded. So there was an opportunity here to continue that entertainment for the Yiddish-speaking audiences, not just the Yiddish-speaking audiences, the Russian-speaking audiences, the Italian, the Greek, and so on and so forth. So you had these ethnic cinemas, these ethnic cinema genres evolving, and Yiddish cinema boomed early on with very inexpensive, often just recordings of theater or of stage plays. Melodrama was a big hit in the Yiddish theater, and it translated to Yiddish cinema. As a matter of fact, one of the great Yiddish actors, the great Boris Tomaszewski, loved in the Yiddish theater. They brought him along in 1934. They put him in front of a camera. And they said, we're going to make a movie with you. Well, Boris didn't know how to act for movies, and the director didn't know how to direct for movies. So here you have the great Boris Tomaszewski making a fool of himself in a film, because it was a genre that he just wasn't comfortable with. But as we move into the mid to late 30s, particularly in Europe, as Jews are slowly but surely being thrown out of the studios in Europe and finding themselves without work, there are now talented filmmakers who have no means of making a living, and very entrepreneurial Jews in Poland in particular said, wow, let's make a higher quality Yiddish movie. We'll bring in these fine technicians, directors, camera people, and we're going to make great Yiddish movies. And terrific Yiddish movies begin in 1936 with Molly Pekin, with Maurice Schwartz, with some of the great actors also. And you have Tevye, and you have Yiddo with a Fiddle, and you have Mamala, and A Brivele der Mamen, and the Dybbuk, all being made in the latter part of the 30s. Why? Because, at least in Europe, Jews have no other place to make a living. In the United States, there's sort of an impact. Wow, they're now making quality movies, higher budget movies in Poland. They're bringing them over here. They're making money on them. Let's make the same quality here in the United States. So at this golden age of Yiddish cinema, as I called it, between 36 and 1940, is largely stimulated by what's going on in Nazi Europe.
What do you think might have happened had there been no Holocaust, and had this large Yiddish-speaking world grown as it would have? What do you think the future of Yiddish film would have been in Europe? Because here already we were going through an Americanization process. People were learning English. The transition took a while, but it happened nevertheless. But what do you think might have occurred there?
I think it would have just evolved as Jews more and more assimilated. Who were the major Yiddish speakers who would have continued to the next generation in Europe? They would have been much more traditional Jews, many of whom wouldn't go to the movies in the first place. So I'm not even sure that there would have been a future back then.
Did any of the directors, you mentioned Tomaszewski as an actor, did any of the directors of Yiddish films of the 30s go on to make movies in English in Hollywood?
Edgar Ulmer really was the only one, and he was a filmmaker who had been making movies in Europe, came here, was making movies here, and continued making movies into the 50s. As a matter of fact, some of the great film noir movies of the 1950s made by Edgar G. Ulmer. In terms of other directors, there was a Polish director, Jan Nowina Przybylski, who went on to Italy and actually created a new career for himself with a different name. But most of the directors were low budget, small directors who never really took the jump.
Do we know the complete canon of Yiddish film today, or are there still some lost treasures being revealed?
The most of the sound films are around. We've lost quite a few of the silent films. That's true not just with Yiddish film, but in general. In Europe and in the United States, a lot of the silent films were made on a nitrate substance, which would literally disintegrate or would be highly explosive, and because of that, would be disposed of. Because if you stored it, that whole facility could blow up. So a lot of treasures have been lost, but periodically, a grandchild opens up a trunk and finds a treasure, and that continues.
Is anything being done in Yiddish today? Any kind of experimental film using Yiddish?
In 1980, an experimental filmmaker decided to come to New York to learn more about experimental cinema, and then he went back to Belgium, and he, together with the great Chantal Akerman, began experimenting with Jewish themes, and he decided to make a film about his own childhood, leaving Poland, stateless after World War II, not having a place to go, finding himself in Belgium, and stateless, and therefore not wanted. And he makes this experimental film called Brussels Transit. And as far as I see it, this 1980 film sets the stage for a renaissance of Yiddish cinema. And you have seen about a dozen to 15 Yiddish language movies since then. And particularly in the last decade, you've seen Yiddish films coming from Israel, from Europe, from Canada, and most recently a horror film set in Williamsburg, where most of the speaking that's going on is between Hasidim, and a lot of it is in Yiddish. As cinema has more and more turned towards a realism of sorts, if you no longer have a film where you have the Germans speaking with a British accent, and the Allies fighting, who are fighting them speaking with an American accent, and that's how you do it. Now the Germans will speak German, and the Dutch will speak Dutch, and the Jews in a particular setting, particularly if it's in World War II, will speak Yiddish. So Yiddish is making a comeback in cinema today.
Well, we'll talk about Israeli film in a minute, but of course on TV with Shtisel, you've really had. I don't think you could be more You can't mainstream Yiddish more than that with a popular television program. So it's listen, it's a really such an expressive language. I grew up with it in my home, and I don't speak it, but my parents did, and it's great to see that it continues to live on, particularly in this way. I want to talk about World War II. Were Jewish GIs featured in American movies during the years of the Second World War? Were they portrayed differently than other members of the military? Were Jewish refugees to be found in wartime movies? I mean, I can think we've just come through Memorial Day weekend and watching TCM, all of the films of celebrating the anniversary of the war and honoring those who served. My impression, the question that I just asked you, I think of the GIs in a film, and there's one from column A and one from column B and one from column C, and there's somebody with a Jewish name. Just saw Pride of the Marines, where we have that. So how were they portrayed in the films of that time?
By 1939, the situation in the United States was pretty bad for Jews. The Nazi Bund was strong. And something happened. I think when America was slowly moving into war by 1940 and then into 1941, as things sort of moved towards more of an anti-German sway, and then finally when the United States got into World War II, the Jewish movie makers said, hey, we're not afraid anymore. We're not going to keep quiet anymore. And they would insert these amazing Jewish characters. And in some cases, even there's a great scene. When you finished school, you worked with the great Dori Shari, who was a very Jewishly connected head of a studio. And Shari said, wait a minute, I'm going to insert a scene where the Catholic priest is sitting there and he's talking to the troops. And he's saying, yeah, I officiated at Zimmerman's, at the Shiva for Zimmerman. And so you have finally Jewish movie makers saying, we are part of America and we're going to stand as Americans and we're going to put ourselves out there as Jews who are proud Americans fighting for the United States. What's fascinating is this continues on for decades. There's no mistake that when Steven Spielberg makes his film about D-Day, and you see the cemetery, the camera pans along the graves at the very beginning, and there's no mistake, there is a Jewish star on one of the first graves you see. Jewish movie makers are saying, we fought and died. And they wanted to assert this.
How would you describe the post-war changes in movie making as it relates to issues facing Jews in the United States? I'm thinking of Crossfire, Gentleman's Agreement. Now we're picking up on what you just said. Now we're picking up not only on having a scene here or there, but we've got motion pictures that are focusing on a very serious problem in the United States, anti-Semitism. Tell us about how you view that period.
So during the war, you see Jewish movie makers coming forward and showing a great deal of pride in their Jewishness, especially with the realization that what is the Allied army is fighting the Nazis who are killing Jews. After the war, what's incredible is that anti-Semitism, which had been at an all-time high in 38 and 39, is just as high in 45 and 46. And after the war is over, the Jewish movie makers sense this. And suddenly they go back into hiding. It's an incredible thing. Hiding, low-key, don't bring attention to ourselves. What the great Dori Shari would call the Schach-Stil approach. Let's keep it very quiet. We'll do it quietly. And then the war comes and stepping forward and taking great pride. And then all of a sudden, this sense of anti-Semitism. Remember, the Allied forces had just defeated fascism. And here, anti-Semitism in the United States is still at the same all-time high as it had been because many people felt that Jews were responsible for getting us into that war. So who steps forward? A non-Jew again, Darrell F. Zanuck. The same guy who had made the House of Rothschilds in 1934 says, wait a minute, anti-Semitism is not acceptable in the United States. Prejudice is not acceptable. Hatred, bigotry, I'm going to fight it. He makes Gentleman's Agreement. And alongside of him, while the elder Jews, those who are really running Hollywood, those in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, are keeping a very low profile because that fear remains. Up steps Dori Shari, this upstart 40-something young producer. And he says, wait a minute, I'm comfortable being a Jew in America. I was born in Newark, New Jersey. I was not born in Europe. And he says, I'm going to also make a film about anti-Semitism because it's not acceptable. So what's fascinating, it's generational. That older generation is still afraid. The younger Hollywood generation that's coming forward and slowly taking over takes that step forward. You don't really see the Jewish character evolving and developing until the late 50s. So there's this quiet period between the anti-Semitism films of Crossfire and Gentleman's Agreement in 47, and then what we will only see in 1956, 57, 58, where suddenly that those young movie makers have now taken over and they're putting out films dealing with Jewish subjects.
Well, 1960 brings us Exodus, and maybe that is a kind of a marker, an important marker as we move forward. Just one word about Dorian. I did work with him when I worked at the Anti-Defamation League, and many years after Crossfire. But he was a very proud Jew, stand-up guy, and very proud of the important impact that he made at that time with that movie. But let's back up a little bit from 1960. I want to talk about the 1950s. It's kind of a down period for actors, for screenwriters, for producers. Film historians remember the 1950s as a time when many talented American writers and performers had their careers stopped, expunged. You talk about cancel culture. That was the early example of cancel culture. Some even spent time in jail due to their political activities, or they may not have had the political activities, but were charged nevertheless. How did blacklisting affect Jewish members of the movie industry and the movie industry itself? And were Jews depicted differently on the screen at that time, or it really didn't make a difference?
So let's take a look at Crossfire. Crossfire is made in 1947. It's released in the summer of 47. And in the late fall of 47, the first hearing of the House on Un-American Activities takes place. Committee members from Congress go out to Los Angeles and begin to launch the inquiries that would eventually move into a full House on Un-American Activities meetings and what would in effect be the blacklisting. Two of the people involved in the making of Crossfire were actively involved in making America a better place. Now, in the 30s, how did you do that? You often would join the Communist Party. And for Americans, sometimes we think, oh, the Communist Party, they were big, Soviet lovers. Well, in fact, many of them were. Did they want to overthrow the United States government? No, not at all. They wanted to make America a better place. Crossfire was seen by these two gentlemen, one of whom was the producer and the other the director, Edward Dmytryk, one of the great Philo-Jewish filmmakers. Interestingly enough, grew up in an anti-Semitic Polish Catholic home. But they wanted to make a social action film that would make America a better place. So you fight anti-Semitism, you make a movie about anti-Semitism, you're making America a better place. Well, but they were communists. And the next thing you know, they're part of the Hollywood 10, the famous 10, actually there were 11, Bertolt Brecht was to be one of them. He went back to Europe after that. But these 10 who were brought before Congress and asked to give the names of others who were communists. And six of the 10 were Jews. And two of them were these non-Jews who had made a film about anti-Semitism. So it had an amazing impact on Jews. Why? Because Jews were more actively involved in trying to make America a better place, just part of our desire to make the world a better place. So the impact that it had on the movie industry was stunning. You lost some of the great talents. And in addition, we'll talk about Dori Shari, we'll talk about Edward G. Robinson. These were guys who were not part of the Communist Party. They were liberals. Dori Shari was a Roosevelt Democrat. Well, he was what became known as gray-listed. Edward G. Robinson was not able to work for a period of time. Why? Because he had given money to liberal causes, some of which crossed, at least in the minds of some Congress people, that line between communism and liberal America. Dori Shari himself had to make a decision as a head of a studio to blacklist other individuals. He fought it. And in the end, he realized that he too would lose his job if he didn't go along with the wave of what was happening in Congress and in the United States. It's a hard period. There were actors who went on to commit suicide. There were actors like Zero Mostel who didn't work for a decade. There were writers who weren't able to write. Fortunately, there were fronts for them who would take their work, put their own name on it, and submit it, so at least they would be able to make a living. It was a bad period, and Jews were a center of that. Why? Because Jews are more active, just as a matter of our tradition, in social action.
One
Sad.
of my one of my father's favorite actors, and one of my favorite actors, as I look at these films today, was John Garfield, who died at the age of 39 from a heart attack. And it is said that the stress brought on by this period may have hastened his demise. Well, let's go to the 1960s because we want to move through this and want to bring it up to.
If I may just interrupt.
Sure, go ahead.
Only
Sure.
because you mentioned John Garfield. In Gentleman's Agreement, John Garfield plays. By the way, his name was Julius Garfinkel. Changed it to John Garfield. He plays a Jewish serviceman, and who's trying to come back into life with Gregory Peck and find a home for himself, and is unable to find an apartment. Why? Because he's a Jew. What's fascinating is that he is in uniform the entire time.
Yeah.
Why? Because Darryl F. Zanuck wanted the American audience to understand that Jews fought, that Jews were good Americans. Sorry.
A point well taken. And I recall right throughout the entire film, he has the uniform. Well, beginning with the 1960s, major changes took place in American society. They're reflected in the types of films made, stories that were told, the actors on the screen. Give us an idea of the current state of the movie industry in terms of Jewish themes and performers, and how it got there since the 1960s. How has it all changed?
As the newer generation began to take over Hollywood and the studios became more independent, the studio system itself broke down. And as I think the civil rights movement changed America, you begin to even see this as early as 1954, 55, 56, this change in America, with Brown versus Board of Education and with Rosa Parks and the civil rights movement. Jews are slowly but surely feeling much more comfortable in America and are ready to come out and not hide the way they did a decade or two earlier. And then slowly but surely, this new generation of young Jewish movie makers moves in and takes hold, American born, totally comfortable, and ready to put out films that are positive portrayals. So you have Exodus, you have Cast a Giant Shadow, you even had a war movie called Tobruk in the mid-1960s, where who were the ones sent in to blow up the German munitions dump? The Palestinian Jews. And then by the late 1960s, with a change in America, remember it's the riots, it's Vietnam, it's a whole bunch of other things. Jews still remain so comfortable in their skins in Hollywood that they begin making fun of themselves. So with 69, 70 into the 90s, you have a lot of films where you have major Jewish characters who are being poked fun at. Why? We feel totally comfortable in the United States of America to the point where we can make fun of ourselves. And that was a very telling moment because it showed that we finally had reached that level of comfort in the United States of America, and it's reflected in cinema.
Yeah, and how do you? I assume amongst those films, Goodbye Columbus,
Goodbye Columbus, Heartbreak Kid, Portnoy's Complaint, and on and on and on.
But you would hear at the time, and there were people who thought they were totally hilarious and understood exactly what was being done there, and then there were others who would kind of say, as they say in Yiddish, "Hashem zach for die Kinder." Let's not have anybody watch this. But I get the point about this kind of maturity or sophistication, if you will, and self-assuredness. I think that relates a lot to it. We have time really for one more question. I want to talk about Israeli film, but before we do, we can't leave this conversation without talking about the impact of Schindler's List. Your take on Schindler's List.
At the time I was writing reviews for a Northern New Jersey newspaper, and the editor said, "I'd like you to write a review about Schindler's List, but After I submitted it, and it was a very positive review. She said, would you be comfortable if on the other side of the page we had a negative review written by her husband, who at the time was writing for the New Jersey, the Bergen Record. And so we placed the two reviews. She placed the two reviews side by side. I thought Schindler's List was groundbreaking. But if you remember at the time, Elie Wiesel, for instance, had said it was trivializing the Holocaust. I see a film like Schindler's List, or even the miniseries Holocaust that was made in the, I think it was 1978, 79. These had major impact in terms of educate. We talk about edutainment, about educating not just the American public, but the world. Holocaust was shown in the United States, and for many, it was the first time that they had even heard about the Holocaust. Then next year, it's brought to Germany, and it changes the way Germans understand their own history. Schindler's List does the same thing a couple of decades later. Very important film. Personally, for I think the greatest filmmaker of today, Steven Spielberg, and also just in terms of our understanding of the Holocaust. Groundbreaking, important, and by the way, I teach it as a film sometimes, just looking at the incredible brilliance of this very talented movie maker.
Well, I agree with you completely. I think that it did exactly what you said. First of all, it internationalized the story, telling the story of the Holocaust, and I think also, if you trace this back, the whole field of Holocaust remembrance and Holocaust education, which followed, not just in the United States, but abroad, and B'nai B'rith works in this area quite a bit. I think a lot of this can be traced to that film, and I think we all, as Jews and beyond, we owe a debt of gratitude to Spielberg for that. A final question, and it relates to Israeli film. Many of them are now wildly popular with international audiences, as are the television shows. We referenced Shtisel on Netflix and Prime and so forth. What stories do films from Israel seek to tell? What is the Israeli movie industry like? I remember what it was like, and there were a few films a year, and it was largely for the Israeli market. That has changed. And let me ask another question: was there a breakout movie that led to this explosion of Israeli films? And tell us your favorite.
So what has happened in Israel is that going back to the 60s, when a first law was created to give some financing to movies. Remember, you're looking at a very small population. So if you make movies for Israelis in Hebrew, it's going to have a finite audience, particularly for world audiences that don't like reading subtitles. That's in the 60s. And slowly but surely, the industry evolves. In 1955, you couldn't find a good film director in Israel. And today, there are 13 film schools producing such talent. I think that Israeli cinema, Israeli movie makers see themselves as we saw muckrakers a century ago. They want to make Israel a better place. So most of the films are tackling difficult subjects to try and make Israel a better place. And it's sometimes difficult. You mentioned watching those comedies of the 80s and 90s. My Aunt Rose used to go, yeah, what a terrible portrayal of the Jews. There are many out here who say, some of these Israeli films are portraying an Israel that we don't necessarily like. But it's a real Israel, and they're trying to make it into a better place. A breakout film, there was a film made called Beyond the Walls. It was made in the 80s, where you had Jews and Palestinian terrorists, common Jewish criminals and terrorists, Palestinian terrorists, in prison together. And they talk to each other. And just think about what we're talking about. We're talking about criminals, actual criminals, and terrorists. And they talk to each other. And the film is about the tension between Jews and Palestinians. The film was shown at the Knesset. So that was a breakout film. It was the first time that Israel's parliament understood that cinema had a message, had a to give, to ask, to say we want to make our country a better place. Some people find it problematic. It's not good for the Jews. It's not good for Israel. I think it's just fantastic. Now, the other piece of it is the wonderful television being made. 20, 30 years ago, they used to bring American writers to Israel to try and teach Israelis how to write better scripts. Now they're bringing Israelis to Hollywood to teach American writers how to write better scripts. As a matter of fact, many of these Israelis are now writing scripts in Hollywood. So a film like Shtisel, Srugim, these are just great films that show a different side of Israel. And you talk about Yiddish. Shira Haas, who is one of the stars of Shtisel, was a classic Israeli young woman whose grandparents spoke Yiddish. They were survivors of the Holocaust. Yiddish pushed away. Now she went and she studied Yiddish to be able to play the part, and she's fallen in love with the language. And that is just permeates, just spreading across Israel, and not just Israel. We're the beneficiaries of it too, just to be able to turn on Netflix or other channels and see these movies.
Well, for sure. Eric, thank you for being here today, helping our audience understand the importance of literally viewing history, particularly Jewish history, through Yiddish, Israeli, and Jewish film. It's been great speaking with you. It's been a great reunion. We hope you'll come back as more of the Israeli films make their way into this market and other aspects of film, because film is so much really a part of the story of our lives. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, our thanks to Dr. Eric Goldman for joining me today and delving into the Jewish experience in cinema and how film helps us examine Jewish history. And thank you for tuning into this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this discussion, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. See you again soon, everyone. Take care.